In this demo, I will show you how to deploy a Kubernetes cluster using Cluster API and the Azure provider and onboard it as an Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster using a Jumpstart automation. This demo will cover the process of onboarding the cluster to Azure Arc as described in the Jumpstart scenario you are seeing here. By the end of this demo, we will have a Kubernetes cluster deployed on Azure VMs projected as an Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. Let's get started. It is important to understand the Cluster API architecture. Here in the Cluster API book page under the Concepts section, we can see the Cluster API architecture diagram. I will not be covering all the Cluster API components, but I will talk about the major pieces that are important to understand for this demo. To get started, we will need to deploy a management cluster, so let's go ahead and open our terminal. The first thing that we need to do is to deploy a management cluster. This cluster will be responsible for deploying the workload cluster using different infrastructure providers, and specifically in our case, the Azure provider. Later in this demo, we will be deploying these cluster API components as well. I will be using Kind to deploy my management cluster locally on my machine. This can be any Kubernetes cluster, but Kind, which stands for Kubernetes in Docker, allows me to be up and running in no time. On my machine, I already have Azure CLI, kubectl, clusterctl, and Kind installed, and as I mentioned, all the detailed prerequisites, instructions on how to deploy this scenario, including Kind installation, are described in the Jumpstart. To deploy the cluster, simply use the Kind create cluster command. The deployment will take a few minutes, so we will come back once it's done. The deployment has completed, and as you can see, I now have a very small Kubernetes cluster deployed. We are now ready to run our automation, so let's review it first by looking at the script, which is also included in the Jumpstart scenario. The first section of the script is where you will edit your environment variables, which include the Kubernetes version and the size of the cluster, as well as in which Azure region the resources will be deployed. To do that, you will also need to add your subscription and tenant ID, as well as your service principal app ID and password. Next, the Cluster API Azure provider will be deployed on the cluster, which will effectively transform our Kind cluster to a management cluster. The Azure provider is responsible for deploying all the Azure resources, such as virtual machines, network components, storage, etc. From there, the management cluster will initiate the process of deploying the workload cluster, and as a result, the Azure resources. The workload cluster is the actual Kubernetes cluster where applications will be deployed in the future. The last section is where the workload cluster will be projected as an Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. It will install or update the required Azure CLI extensions for Azure Arc and will then connect the cluster to Azure Arc. Before running the script, let's open the Azure portal. Notice how I currently don't have any Cluster API resource group. Upon completion, we will have a new Azure resource group where all the resources will be located. Now that we have validated we have no deployed Azure resources and reviewed the script, let's run it. Notice the extra dot which will apply the environment variables in the script to this shell session. Depends on the number of cluster nodes you are deploying, the script will take a few minutes to complete. Now that the script run has completed, let's review. You can see how the workload cluster is deployed and onboard to Azure Arc, and if I will run the kubectl get nodes command again, you can see the cluster is up and running. Let's switch back to the Azure portal. If I will refresh the page, we now have a new Azure resource group with all the resources deployed. Let's group the resources by type for an easy view. As you can see, you now have a new Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster. I'll click on the cluster, you will be able to see the metadata of it and the fact that it's connected. In this demo, we deployed a Kubernetes cluster using Cluster API and the Azure provider and projected it as an Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster, all using the Jumpstart automation provided. Thank you.